Chapter 1. Rock shattered to dust beneath the immense weight of the mammoth, sending fragments spraying to the scraggly brush. 90 hands high, its enormity cloaked in matted black fur nearly 2 feet thick, the mammoth towered over the land, seeming to dwarf even the distant mountains and their claw like peaks. When the behemoth moved, the world trembled, each plodding step causing stones to topple from the hills around it. The boulders shattered, rattled, and crashed down, step like terraces, to smack against the brute's legs as they rolled into the plain below. The mammoth ignored the impacts with godlike disdain. The flesh beneath its leathery hide scarcely scratched. The gigantic head swung from side to side, enormous black eyes studying the slopes around it, curved ivory tusks reflecting the summer sun. The massive trunk, like a bloated jungle python, reared back, coiling against the mammoth's scaly face. The mob beneath the trunk gaped wide, and a deafening bellow boomed from the beast's body. The roar of a hunting titan. Men covered their ears as the mammoth's bellow thundered across the sky, their skulls throbbing from the nearness of the sound. The wall platform had been lashed to the beast's back, a small fort of ivory and bone covered in hides and of fur and skin. Within this fort, men clung to leather straps and watched the land pass beneath them as their colossal steed lumbered through their dusty hills. Even as they guarded their ears against the trumpeting bellow, the men kept wary eyes trained upon the hills, and ready hands upon short throwing spears that rested in leather baskets beside them. Each of the men was stocky in build, with powerful thews of bulging muscle. Their dusky skin bore the scars of sun and wind, their broad faces the lean hunger of hardship and travail. Upon some, strange lesions and bizarre growths marred the uniformity of limb and visage. Others carried still more outrageous displays of what was called the gift of the gods. For these men were of the savage tribe, descended from the mighty Tong, who dwelled deep within the chaos wastes, on the very threshold of the realm of the gods. They wore their armor of bone and fur with pride, and adorned their dark top knots with talismans of ivory and bronze. There was no arrogance in their adornment, for the savage were too secure in their superiority to feel the need to boast. A lone savage stood in a cage of ivory chained around the mammoth's neck. Like his kinsman, he was dark of skin, with a broad, hungry face. A trick of the gods had made his eyes the color of gold, shining like coins from their dark setting. Blotches of discolored skin ran across the tribesman's body, marking his flesh like the belly of a toad. But there was no aberration in the cords of muscle that swelled his arms, nor the sharp intelligence that peered from the golden eyes. Dorgo Foe Crusher was among the greatest of his tribe's warriors. Son of their Khan, Hutka Steelskin. In his 25 summers, he had killed 100 foes in battle. Kurgan, Hung, and even the despicable beastkin of the Grey had shed their lives on his blade. Dorgo had earned the respect of his tribesmen with each victory, but still he yearned for more. There was one savage he could never be able to impress, the only one of his tribe who mattered so far as he was concerned. If he was to succeed Hutka as Khan, he would need to prove himself worthy to the grizzled warlord. He wondered if he would ever be possible to meet his father's high demands. The warrior shook his head, forgetting for a time his mired ambitions. He needed to keep his mind on the hunt. He lifted his gaze to the rocky hills that peppered the plain. They rose in crumbling mounds, worn down into cracked stumps by wind and rain. Dorgo could still see the broken fragments of stone towers rising from their summits, could still make out the step like plateau that marched up the sides of the hills. Once those steppes would have been terraced gardens, overflowing with rice and wheat and green things of every description. The towers would have been filled with warriors, warily watching over the gardens at their feet. This place had been the granary of Teocte, where the great warlord had carved his kingdom from the desolation of the steppes. The towers and gardens, even the hills, had been built with the sorcery of his shamans and the sweat of his slaves. With his gardens, Teocte would feed his horde and expand his domain across the Shadowlands. The whispers of the shining dream still lingered in the places like this, calling out to men like Dorgo, who possessed the imagination to hear them. The ruins of Teocte's dream were scattered across his kingdom, like old bones slowly wearing away beneath the unforgiving sun. In his ambition, the king had not reckoned upon the wrath of the gods. He had been brought low. The Shadowlands never fell beneath the banners of the savage, and today only 8 tribes remained of what had once been Teote's numberless horde. Dorgo shook his head again, scolding himself for allowing his thoughts to wander once more. It was a failing his father never ceased to observe, scolding Dorgo that there was too much of a dreamer around him to ever make a good Khan. Dorgo's fist tightened as he recalled the scornful words. Perhaps he was a dreamer, but so too had Teocte been. The mammoth's trunk reared back again, and the beast's bellow roared across the land. Dorgo studied the hills, watching every sign of movement among the rocks. Despite the years since they had been irrigated, the plants still erupted from the dusky soil upon the terraces. This drew goats and elk into the hills, where the uneven ground would protect them from wolves. Even men had a difficult time trying to stalk the animals through the old gardens, where the treacherous ground forever threatened a murderous fall to the plain below. The other tribes only even attempted the feat in times of famine, but the savage were better, their minds sharper than the dull wit of the Kurgan, the Hung, and they did not climb into the crumbling hills. They made their prey come to them. The mammoth's trumpet was a sound to strike terror into any man, and beasts were not immune to such fear. When the mammoth bellowed, more than just rocks were knocked loose from the hills. Deer and elk, goats and sheep, even sickle-clawed hill tiger would leap from the refuges, scattering through the rocks to escape the angry giant. In their panic, even sure-footed goats and nimble deer would stumble, to pitch headlong into the plain below. Throwing spears at the savage standing in the howdah made short work of any animals not killed by the fall. It was a method of hunting that had been developed by generations of tribesmen until it had been refined to a precise art. Dorgo's people never lacked for meat, even in the hardest winters or the driest summers, simply because they had mastered the crumbling hills. This day, however, only rocks clattered down from the hills. The savage hunters and even the war mammoth began beneath them began to sense an eerie wrongness around the hills around them, an unseen menace lurking somewhere nearby. Savage hands left the ivory shafts of throwing spears to clutch the grip of axe, sword, and flail. A new urgency crept into the eyes, watching the hills, no longer looking for the fleeing shapes of goat and elk. Every man remembered tales and legends about the strange creatures that sometimes crept down into the hills from the forbidden wastes. They wondered if such a monster could be bold enough to attack a war mammoth. They wondered if they would be bold enough to meet it in turn. Dorgo watched the rocks, waiting for the lurking menace to show itself, waiting for the attack to crash down upon them in an avalanche of violence. The brooding hills defied his vigilance, remaining silent and empty, mocking him, whatever secret they held. When the attack came, it erupted from below, not above. The silence was broken by savage war cries as the slopes of the hills exploded in brutality and violence. Warriors lunged into the sunlight from concealed burrows, like a mass of angry ground vipers. Taller than savage, their skins pale, their bodies twisted by grotesque knots of muscle, the warriors rushed at the startled war mammoth with panther like speed. Dorgo cursed as he saw the ragged armor of hide and bronze lashed around their disfigured frames, as he saw the ghastly masks of flesh that were tied across their faces. The warriors of the Muhawk, one of the Kurgan tribes, and the most pitiless rivals of the savage. Each Muhawk carried a long spear with a jagged iron head, the edges of the point barbed and cruel. Dorgo saw at once that the Kurgan were sprinting towards the mammoth's legs, fearlessly charging at the behemoth to reach its soft underbelly. He roared commands to the hunters in the howdah behind him, cursing at them to hurl their javelins and stop the rushing Muhawk. Several of the warriors fell as javelins sank into their brutish bodies, but for each that crumpled to the ground, three darted beneath the mammoth's pillar like legs, jabbing up at its belly with their cruel pikes. Dorgo struggled to turn the beast, to bring it around to confront the foe, but the stabbing pain in its vitals broke the savage's tenuous control on the mammoth. Mad by the pain, the brute refused to move, simply bellowing and wailing in anguish. The Muhawk beneath it continued to savage its belly, relentlessly, only when oily ropes and entrails spilled from the wound. The mammoth reared back on its hind legs, crashing down in a bone jarring impact. One Muhawk lingered to press his attack against the stricken beast, was smashed beneath the brute's leg, crushed into a red smear. The hunters in the howdah forgot their javelins as the platform lurched upwards, pointing them at the sun, hands tightening around the leather straps in desperation. White knuckled grips and gravity jerked at the men upon the tilting platform. One savage, slow to seize the strap, pitched and screamed in despair to the ground 30 feet below, his head splattering against the rocky ground. Dorgo whipped the mammoth with the ivory goad he held, trying to force it to obey the runes carved upon the ancient talisman. The gnawing fire of its wound overwhelmed both training and spell. The mammoth's pain trumpets tearing at the sky. The Muhawk retreated to the safety of the slopes, jeering at the savage, throwing spears at their steed to encourage its frenzy. The reeling mammoth fell back to the earth with a mighty crash. The impact tore leather straps from their fastenings, and three savage plummeted from the behemoth's back to lie broken upon the ground. As the mammoth continued to stomp and bellow, the other hunters threw chains down from the howdah. Hand over hand, they rappelled down the beast's flanks, desperate to escape its crazed agony. The boldest of the Muhawk charged down from the slopes to confront the fleeing men. Screams added to the clamor of the mammoth's pain as the Kurgan drove their long spears into the descending men, pinning them to the mammoth's thick hide as they pierced their bodies. The few men who reached the ground tried to fend off the opportunistic Muhawk, chopping at them with axe and sword. Two Muhawk fell, too slow in reacting to the threat of foes who could strike back. The others cast aside their long spears, useless at close quarters, and drew cruel bone cudgels from belts of dried sinew. The savage rushed the Kurgan, determined to avenge their butchered kin. Bone cracked against iron as the two sides converged, tong curses mixing with Muhawk war cries.